What's up, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Risky Business. In my last video, I talked a lot about the history behind the development of The Last Remnant. Check that out if you haven't already done so. In this video, I'm going to be talking more about the concrete elements of the game. Graphics, music, sound, and the various presentation and design elements that make up the world of The Last Remnant. Let's get to it. I discussed last time how Square Enix decided to create this game in Unreal Engine 3, an engine with which their developers were unfamiliar. As a result, a number of challenges arose, including frame rate drops and the now notorious texture pop-in, an immersion-breaking issue that is constant in this game, even when modifying the files of the PC version to reduce it. Luckily, the remaster is in Unreal Engine 4 and does not have that issue. With that elephant out of the room, I would like to talk about how good this game looks. For a game that was originally released on the Xbox 360, it looks like it would be right at home on the Xbox One and PS4. The textures are higher resolution and more detailed than you would expect. Even when playing the PC version at 1440p, I'm impressed with just how good everything looks. Most of the games in this era were built for 720p, and this one seems to have been ported with the idea in mind of running at a higher resolution and smoother frame rates, although the frame rate is capped at 60. The remaster has a number of improvements, including smoother rendering and better lighting. The graphics look much smoother and brighter in the remaster, although the anti-aliasing does cause a slight blur. Between the two, I actually prefer the old version on PC. Now, before we get on to our next step here, please do me a favor, like and subscribe, help me grow this channel, but the biggest favor you could do for me would be to watch this video all the way to the end. That's the thing that YouTube cares about the most. Thanks, now let's move on. The character designs may be one of this game's weaker elements, with the optional characters you'll encounter in the game being infinitely more interesting to look at than the main characters. The Sykes family is about as plain as an RPG character could possibly be, with the protagonist Rush being possibly the most boring of all of them. The bright side is that when you meet David's generals, you start to see the real creativity behind the four races that inhabit the game world. Beyond the aggressively human-like Mitra are the Kisiti, something of a humanoid cross between a frog and a rabbit, the massive Yama, who resemble fish creatures, and my favorite, the Sovani, a race of four-armed cat people. The Last Remnant is full of NPCs who look like each other, and there are hundreds of identical soldiers you can hire to join your squad, but the real strength of the character design is in the unique leaders, 40 altogether, each one with a unique face and wardrobe. Even the Mitra have distinct appearances, a priest, a witch, a knight, and lots of others. The Yama have different colored skin and armor, the Kisiti have many different colors and fashions, and the Sovani are distinguished not only by the color of their fur and other tribal markings, but also by ornate armor that is like nothing else in the game. I really wish they had dug into the lore of these various races just a little bit more. Each character's design gives the player hints about what their strengths are in battle, but we'll discuss that in greater depth in a future video when we talk about the gameplay elements of The Last Remnant. That's going to be a doozy. In interviews in print media, Square Enix would say that making character designs that stand out was an important part of The Last Remnant's development. It certainly has a unique art style. The design team was headed by Yusuke Naura and Yukio Nakatani. Naura's influence can be seen all over The Last Remnant, which is highly reminiscent of the work he had done on Final Fantasy X, The Bouncer, and Unlimited Saga. Nakatani had previously been a designer on Chrono Trigger, Xenogears, Final Fantasy VII and its sequels, Crisis Core and Dirge of Cerberus, but you don't see his style coming out quite as much. Another element of visual design that was built to stand out was the remnants themselves. Ancient artifacts of incredible power, the remnants are the glue that holds the world together. Those who have wealth and power only have it because of the remnants they've bound. Shining and brimming with light, the remnants look otherworldly, like they don't quite belong. They can be seen in many of the game's dungeons, but are most striking when they hover above the city maps. divine structures climbing high above their domain. Of course, an RPG would be nothing without a variety of creatures to battle, and the monster designs run the gambit from the mundane to the insanely imaginative, with inspiration clearly taken from tons of fantasy lore. You'll battle giant bugs, muscle-bound colossi, corrupted beholders, wyverns, dragons, and more. I think the most visually striking enemies you'll face are these alien demon-type creatures like the Fallen. Coolest designs in the game, in my opinion. While the game has hundreds of enemies for you to battle, a lot of them are palette swaps. There's enough variety that the enemy types you'll encounter will switch up, but you'll see familiar shapes every time you enter a new area. Even rare monsters aren't unique, but they're just more powerful versions of existing enemies, and that's kind of a bummer. There are a few real boss-type enemies in the game, and most of them are humanoid but with unique and creative designs. The game's main protagonist, the Conqueror, is kind of a curious-looking character. As we've discussed before, this game was made with a worldwide audience in mind, so maybe the designers felt that a villain who looks like a cross between Brad Pitt and Fabio would appeal to the Western market. The swole star of shampoo commercials falls a little flat when compared to the monstrous and twisted enemies RPG players are accustomed to. It's a curious choice for sure. When non-human bosses do show up, their designs are larger than life. Many of them look incredibly alien, like they come from outer space or the very depths of hell itself. They absolutely succeed in standing out against the world in which they live. The Last Remnant has a number of environments that will be visited over and over again. Some are parts of the story that you'll only see once, but others are explorable areas where you'll find multiple quests, side missions, and enemies and materials to farm. There are also cities to visit to stock up on supplies, just like in any RPG, although it's all tied together much differently from most of us are used to. The overworld is just a map, just kind of like Final Fantasy Tactics, where the player moves a cursor to fast travel to any available location in the world. Sometimes you have to talk to specific NPCs in order for an optional area to open up. There are a ton of optional areas here. Others are opened by the story or by side quests. There are very few areas that the player can travel between without visiting the world map first. While there are some areas that are connected, most of them are not. Visiting towns and cities is a different experience. While they look and feel quite a lot like the cities of Final Fantasy XII, each city has its own smaller version of the overworld map through which the player can travel between areas. The areas themselves are relatively small, but usually full of NPCs, most of whom are standing still. Although the activity in some cities can vary. Sometimes it seems really lively and other times it seems kind of desolate. Still, each city has a unique look and they can be easily distinguished from one another. Outdoor zones include beautiful landscapes with a high level of detail. Water and grass look incredible, and while even more boring zones still have a pretty fantastic visual design. There's not a tremendous amount of repetition in the environments, which is a welcome change from a lot of RPGs. There's tons of different kinds of dungeons, from castles to servers to a large crystal tower. They all have a lot of personality. There's some repetition with the cave areas, but the variety in the rest of the game kind of makes up for that. I never found myself getting bored of the environments, and there are a number of details that stand out in each zone. It's impressive that there are quite a few large, unique dungeons to explore. And depending on what version of the game you're playing and what your settings are, you can often see a really great large field of view. And you can see other pieces of the dungeon as you're exploring. You can even sometimes see large enemies that are far away from you. And I think that's a really nice touch to add to the feeling of adventure and exploration. During battles, the camera moves around the battlefield and it makes it look like there's a really large fighting area. There's so much animation, there are flashy effects, there's a lot of movement, and during the more intense moments, there's a lot to take in. The game is always giving you so much information, not just in the form of text on screen, but just in the form of the environment you're fighting in, the motion the characters are doing, the way everything moves. It's very stimulating, as a matter of fact. In spite of the disjointed presentation of an overworld without an explorable map, it all ties together. It creates this world that feels alive and it's full of magic and mystery. If you were to compare that to some of the more modern JRPGs where it almost feels like you're walking through a hallway for the entire game, it's definitely a different way of presenting that same sort of world. But rather than just walking down a hallway where everything is interconnected through this one corridor, you have a map that makes it feel like there's a lot more space in between those areas than there really is. Now, we talked a lot about the graphics. I want to talk about the sound, in particular the music. One of the major initiatives with the game was to sell the soundtrack, and it was sold as a 3 CD set. It was a big deal. So let me tell you, it is absolutely packed to the gills with bangers. I mean, if you listen to the background tracks on this video, this stuff is incredible. It's clear that an incredible amount of work and care went into crafting a soundtrack that fits the mood of every zone, every scene, and every mission in the game. Most of the tracks were composed by Tsuyoshi Sekito, who also scored Brave Fencer Musashi and Final Fantasy VII Advent Children. Sekito is a guitarist in the novelty Final Fantasy cover band The Black Mages, so it makes sense that so many of these tracks have almost a power metal feel, with these orchestral sections paired with heavy metal guitars. Really cool for me because I love symphonic metal, so I'm on board. These tracks are perfect for presenting a fantastical world full of action and danger. 10 of the game's 97 tracks were composed by Yasuhiro Yamanaka, who would go on to make many contributions to Square Enix's music catalog, composing and arranging tracks for Final Fantasy, Saga, and many other projects. Because The Last Remnant was produced with the idea in mind of making both the English and Japanese performances of the same quality, and released at the same time, it stands to reason that the voice acting in the Western release would be ahead of its time. There are nearly 50 voice actors in the game, meaning that every character sounds unique. Seeing the mouth movement of every character sync up to their dialogue makes a tremendous difference in the quality of the presentation here. And while the performances are hardly Oscar-worthy, they're certainly in the upper tier for this generation. Leading the cast is Johnny Young Bosch, who you might remember as Adam Park, one of the Power Rangers for 4 seasons. Young Bosch has an incredible resume as a voice actor. He voiced Kaneda in the English version of Akira, and he's Vash in the new Trigun Stampede reboot, along with countless other notable performances. Check out his IMDb page, there's a lot of stuff on there. He's done a lot of great voice work. These visual and audio elements come together to form a package that I think was ahead of its time in a lot of regards. The footage that's on your screen is from 2009, and this is not the remaster. The voice cast captures each character's personality and makes for a cinematic experience that does not get nearly enough credit. Some of the voices in this game were truly distinctive. Characters like David and Irina in particular, they absolutely stand out, and the performances are top-notch. Unfortunately, the cinematic experience is somewhat marred by the rather underwhelming story, which we're going to talk about in greater detail in the next part of the series, before we go on to the final part of the series where we'll do the long-form video about the incredibly deep gameplay. So once again, please subscribe and enable notifications. Thank you so much for watching till the end. Make sure you don't miss the next part of this series. If it's been released already, it'll play next right away, but otherwise there's going to be another great video playing right next for you. And if you look on the screen, there's going to be a link to one of my other videos. I'd love for you to check that out. Next time, we're going to talk all about the story and lore of The Last Remnant, and check out my channel for lots of other retro gaming content, including RPGs and all other different games from the Super Nintendo, NES, Sega Genesis, and more. Thank you once again, and until next time, game over.